Okay, welcome back, everybody. Today's lecture video is a little bit of a different format. We'll be talking about Chapter 7, which covers economic growth. And I think you'll find that this chapter is pretty intuitive. We're covering a lot of concepts that you might already be familiar with. We're just providing that economic foundation for understanding them. Okay, so our key questions for this chapter. First, we're going to talk about what economic growth is and talk about how we measure economic growth. Then we'll be looking at the factors that contribute to economic growth. And one big discussion when we talk about development and economic growth is trying to figure out why some countries are wealthier than others and trying to understand why some countries seem to be stuck at their current level of productivity while other countries are able to grow much more rapidly. And to wrap up, we'll be talking about the different policies that governments might be able to use that can help to raise their growth rates and their long run living standards. All right, to motivate our discussion, we're first starting with this table, and this table is showing us the real GDP per capita for all of these different countries at both the start of this period, so between 1870 and 1900, and the end of this period, which is 2014. So the first thing to notice here is that there's a very large difference in the different living standards around the world. So we use GDP per capita as a measure for a living standard, because GDP measures our productivity, right? And when productivity is high, when real GDP is high, this means that incomes are larger generally. And with larger incomes, people are able to consume more, and more consumption means that they're able to purchase goods and services that make their lives more convenient, healthier, safer, all of those things. So we see here in this table, some countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, their real GDP measured in dollars is only about 3 to 5 thousand per person. Whereas in wealthier countries like Japan, Germany, Canada, the US, that real GDP per capita is much higher. The second thing that we want to talk about is the significant variation in growth rates across different countries. So the growth rate is measuring that increase in GDP or that increase in productivity. And we see that some countries, whether they're developed, whether they're wealthy or poor, are growing much more slowly than others. And we want to talk about why that is. So, because we see that countries differ in terms of their growth rates, this means that when we try to create a list that ranks countries by their income, this list is constantly changing over time. So, if we made a list of the top 10 economies in 1800 versus 1900 versus now, those lists would look different. They would contain different countries. And so, one of the benefits that we see from this is this tells us that poor countries are not necessarily stuck to be in their situation forever. The other thing that we can take away from this is we know that rich countries should not take their status for granted. Wealthy countries may be growing more slowly, and these poorer countries that are growing faster could eventually surpass them in terms of productivity. Okay, so when we talk about economic growth, productivity is the main way that we measure growth. So productivity is highly related to GDP or GDP per capita, which measures output. So when we measure productivity, we are looking at output per worker. And productivity is highly related to the standard of living. As we said before, when real GDP is high, this means that real GDP per capita is high, productivity is high, and higher real GDP means higher incomes, so people are able to consume more. And this consumption offers them, greater comfort, health, and safety in their lives. So, as we've said, productivity is the key determinant for living standards, but productivity is also positively associated with positive changes in the other factors that are used to measure the standard of living. So, what we see in the real data across different countries is that as real GDP increases, we tend to see increases in things like educational attainment, access to healthcare, access to sanitation facilities, all of these various factors. So, this is sort of confirmation for us that productivity is, a useful measure for growth, useful measure for living standards because it's related to all of these other important factors. And lastly, sustained economic growth is an economy's goal or a government's goal. And governments want this long-term economic growth because it improves their living standard in their country, and they can achieve this through increasing worker productivity. All right, so now we're going to get into the determinants of productivity. And first, we have our two kinds of capital. So, physical capital is any equipment or structures that are used to produce goods and services. This is machinery, real estate, factories, buildings, all of these things that are used in production. And next, we have human capital. And human capital is any accumulated knowledge or skills that workers are getting through education, training, or work experience, learning on the job. And what we know is that when both physical capital and human capital are higher, this improves worker productivity. So this is a pretty intuitive concept. If you were making t-shirts and selling them as a small business and you were stitching all of these shirts by hand, it would be very difficult for you to produce a lot of t-shirts, right? You're doing them all by hand. It's going to be very time consuming. Whereas if you bought a sewing machine, a piece of capital, the your productivity would increase greatly. You'd be able to produce many more shirts than you did when you were stitching them by hand. Similarly, you're taking this class, you're in college, so the knowledge that you're gaining through education is going to make you more productive in the respective career that you're choosing. And so within a society, we call this increasing in the level of capital per person, capital deepening. And capital deepening is one of the ways that we can increase productivity. Next, we have natural resources, and natural resources are any input to production that's provided by nature. So this could be land, water, mineral deposits, any resource that's coming from nature that we're using in production. And what we know, again, similarly to capital, is that when more natural resources are available, our productivity will be higher. Next, we have technological knowledge, and this is a big one. Increases in technology also improve our productivity. So, any sort of advance in knowledge, any new invention, or any innovation, any new application of existing technological knowledge is going to improve our productivity as a whole. And this last one here, economies of scale, is just saying that as industries grow in size, there are actually cost advantages to operating that industry. So as a business grows, the per unit cost to produce is decreasing over time. Okay, so now we want to combine all of these factors that determine productivity into what we call the aggregate production function. And a production function is just a process by which a firm is turning economic inputs into outputs. And I'm sorry, I noticed there's a typo here. This should say the process by which a firm turns economic inputs into outputs. So we can think of the production function as, a machine with a conveyor belt. So there's a conveyor belt here, and then there's a sort of black box machine where all of the production is occurring. And so we take our inputs in on the conveyor belt, they go into that machine, production occurs, and then on the other side of the conveyor belt, out come our outputs. So that little machine in the middle, we would consider our production function. And in macroeconomics, we are focusing on the aggregate production function, which is the connection from inputs to outputs for the entire economy. And what we will do is we'll measure this output using GDP per capita. So on this slide, we have a visual representation of our aggregate production function. So in these blue boxes, we're showing our inputs. So the workforce being labor, human capital, physical capital, technology. We can include natural resources here as well. And the arrows are representing that production process, and our output is GDP or GDP per capita. Okay, so we've talked about the factors that are affecting economic growth, including physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technology. But there are other, societal features that can determine whether or not a country has a healthy climate for economic growth. So, what we want is we want markets that are allowing people and businesses to be incentivized for increasing capital and to improve macroeconomic growth. But at times, markets are unable to efficiently allocate capital and technology in a way that provides the greatest benefit to society. And so, in situations like these, this is where the government can step in and apply some public policy to encourage productivity growth and improve the living standard. So, a very common example is that private education is not considered to be the most beneficial for society. So, the government steps in and supplies public education. the government can also provide infrastructure, including roads, bridges, things like that. The government should be encouraging political stability, strong property rights, which we'll talk about later, health and nutrition. So, all of these things are ways that the government can step in and provide extra support to encourage long run growth. So, as we said, strong laws and strong property rights are another key factor that the government has that can influence economies' long run growth and productivity. So, a stable legal system actually encourages people to invest and produce, and that can allow, a stable foundation for economic growth. So, first, we're going to talk about the adherence to rule of law, and it's the government's role to enact laws that protect the rights of individuals and businesses to use their property as they see fit. And in order for these laws to be effective, they have to be clear, they have to be properly enforced, and they have to apply to all members of society. So I think this is a pretty intuitive one to understand. We can imagine that you own a large plot of land and you're planning to use that land for agriculture and grow some crops on it. But let's say the government is not properly enforcing property rights. So, people in the neighborhood are not recognizing that you own that land. So this means that somebody could try to come steal it from you. Other people are using your land without your permission. And because of this, you might say, hey, it's not worth it for me to invest in this land, buy all of the farming equipment, fertilizer, seeds, and all of those things, if there's no guarantee that your land is protected. So this is a case of where, defined property rights and enforceable property rights are actually an incentive for people to invest and produce. And this can help us to maintain productivity and sustain that economic growth. Very similarly, the protection of contractual rights can act in this way. So businesses often enter into contractual agreements, and if there is no legal system that will help to enforce those contracts, and punish people who are breaking these legal agreements, this can also hinder investment and productivity. So, as we've said, some countries are much wealthier than others, and some countries are growing at a faster rate than others. So, a big question when we're looking at this question of growth is, will these poorer countries be able to grow fast enough to eventually catch up to the wealthier countries so that the standard of living is more uniform across the world? So, convergence is a pattern within which economies that have a low per capita GDP are growing faster than those that have a high per capita GDP. So they'll catch up to those wealthier countries. And this table to the right is just showing the average growth rate of real GDP for different rankings of economies. So we have high income economies, low income economies, and middle income economies. And what we see in this table is that middle income countries are growing faster than low income countries. So that would be an argument against convergence because those middle income countries are wealthier than the low income, but they're also growing faster than the low income countries. So the low income countries won't necessarily be able to catch up to the middle income countries. But what we also see in this table is that low income countries are growing faster than high income countries. So our question here is, will there be convergence? Is convergence something that we can reasonably expect to happen over time as these countries are growing? So some of the arguments favoring convergence, these are arguments that are used to say that we do believe convergence could happen, is that low-income countries might have an advantage in achieving a greater worker productivity than these higher income countries did. So in lower income countries may find it easier to improve technologies because they can just immediately apply technology that was already invented when the high income countries were growing in the past. So, for example, with things like internet, electricity, these lower income countries that have not fully adopted this new technology, instead of adopting the old dial-up internet that was popular 20, 30 years ago, they're just going to jump straight to Wi-Fi or maybe fiber optic. And so this will allow them to essentially jump forward in terms of the technology that they apply, and this could rapidly increase their productivity. We also think that low-income countries may be able to learn from the experiences of higher income countries that grew in the past, and they can say, okay, we should do this, we shouldn't do that, based on what they observed from this previous growth in other countries. Next, some arguments against convergence. So these arguments essentially say that we don't believe convergence will be possible. And so the first one here is that a country that develops a new technology can essentially sidestep that diminishing marginal returns that comes with capital deepening. So for wealthy countries that are developing new technology, this new technology may negate any diminishing marginal returns to capital and actually boost that higher income country to grow even quicker or faster than a low income country. Um, and also, there's no guarantee that low income countries will be able to perform better when they adopt a new technology. So, for example, like we were talking about internet access, so low income countries can skip adopting dial up internet and move straight to Wi Fi or fiber optic. But it's also very likely that low income countries may not have the infrastructure to adopt this new technology. So, fiber optic internet is very new, it's very expensive. And so, these new technologies might not be relevant to the activities for growth that are needed in low income countries. So our conclusion here is that if there is any economic convergence, it is happening very slowly. So the economic convergence between high income countries and middle to low income countries is possible, but it's happening very slowly over a very long period of time. And this is because high income countries have been building up their advantage in living standards over decades and centuries. So countries like the UK, the US, all of these countries that went through the Industrial Revolution have been essentially building up their advantage in terms of productivity and standard of living since then. And that compounding growth has put them very far ahead of some low income countries. So, in order for these low income countries to catch up, it could take a very long time. All right, so the last thing I want to touch on today is whether or not natural resources are a limitation on economic growth. So, a very famous economist named Thomas Malthus argued in the 1800s that population growth is going to deplete Earth's non-renewable resources at a faster rate than we can replenish them. So, essentially, our supply of natural resources is going to become scarce and it's going to deplete and deplete, and we're not going to be able to sustain our population growth over time in the future. But what we see is that technological progress often finds its ways to avoid these limitations. So hybrid cars use less gas, so that helps us to conserve on our usage of oil. Better insulation for homes reduces the energy that we need to use to heat them or cool them, depending on the season. And this is a big one here. Fertilizers and agricultural techniques have increased the amount of crop yield that we can get from the same fixed amount of land. So what we would think here is that it's not necessarily the case that our natural resources are going to be our limitation for growth, because throughout history, we've shown that technological progress helps us to prevent any sort of limitation. Another key point here is that in a market economy, scarcity is reflected in prices, as we learned in chapter 3. So, what we would expect is that as a natural resource becomes scarce, the price of that resource would increase over time. And as those prices increase, this would discourage the consumption of that specific resource. So this can act as some sort of natural mechanism to, discourage the use of that resource if it's becoming too scarce. What we see in the real data, though, is that the prices of most natural resources are stable or even decreasing. So this provides some evidence that our ability to conserve these resources is growing faster than we are depleting the supply. All right, that's it for today. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, just feel free to send me an email.